Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, it's my pleasure to be joined by Chris Riley. Chris is a principal of Supply Chain and Procurement at Deloitte Consulting, based in Perth, Australia. Now, Chris has worked across a number of procurement roles in the UK, Singapore, and now Australia with companies such as Ford, Gemini, Lloyds Banking Group, and Rio Tinto. And as you'll hear in the show, Chris was also one of my former flatmates back at the start of our procurement careers, and also a groomsman in my wedding, so I'm not quite sure why it's taken us 8 years to actually record a podcast and bring Chris to Art of Procurement. Now, in our conversation, Chris and I discuss that after the elevated role that procurement has enjoyed the last couple of years in response to supply and cost pressures, where do we actually go next? We also discussed the concepts of portfolio management and operational excellence in the context of leading a procurement team, and as tools to drive both significant short and long-term improvements in procurement performance. And so let's go into the podcast, where I started by asking Chris if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Yeah, look, great question. I love it when you do this. For me, look, procurement definitely found me quite literally. We sort of had a milk round in the UK where organisations came into the university, and I remember Ford Motor Company, procurement and logistics came to our university, and so very literally they found me. I listened to the story that was getting told. I was actually more interested in logistics. I could probably understand that one more than procurement at the time, but yeah, I remember finding the Ford team very interesting, and made my application to join the grad program. The same one I met you yourself at.
Yeah, it's funny. So I was going to ask you. So you actually chose procurement, did you, as part of that, or did they just say, "Hey, you're on the scheme, you can go and do purchasing"?
Yeah, there was a lot of I remember there was commercial roles at the likes of Mars and Unilever. There was the Ideson consulting roles, and then Ford. So I remember it's probably hedging my bets across a few industries. But just there was something certainly interested about probably the sector as well of automotive. I had a bit of a family background through automotive, and there was something that just caught the imagination, particularly in that sort of operational, let's say, logistics side. So I still swear I applied for logistics and ended up in procurement. So I'm going to say but I'm very pleased. So it certainly found me right at the start of my career.
I know I hoped to be in marketing, and they put me in purchasing. But and I had no clue what purchasing even was. But for most people who are listening won't know, I know you're more than the typical guest that we have on the show. So we started on the grad scheme. I think you were the year before I was.
Yeah.
We ended up living together in it was funny, like purchasing house, wasn't it? Almost like four of us were all buyers in Ford or Vistion, which was a part that spun out of Ford. And you were in my wedding as well. So I don't know how it's been 570 episodes since we've actually done a podcast together, but it's a thrill for you to be on the pod today.
No, and look, genuinely a real privilege. It's sort of it's a blast from the past every time I hear your dulcet tones over the podcast. So real honour to be able to join today.
Not quite the Yorkshire accent it used to be.
Not quite.
So you worked in the UK. You've worked in Singapore. You're now in Australia.
Yeah.
So you've worked, a number of different countries, number of different industries. You're in Australia right now. Do you see, is procurement different in Australia than it is in other countries that you've been in?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question. I certainly think there is a maturity probably globally. I think certainly coming from the UK, coming from the automotive sector. So I think it's probably sector. It's probably a question around geography and sector. I often reflect back on the automotive days when your margins are less than 5%, and sort of 80% of your cost base is third parties. The importance of the supply chain and procurement particularly at that time, the cost-saving agenda, it was so instrumental to P&L. When you're in other sectors, banking, and the one I play into a lot, energy and resources, and it's often quite a different factor in terms of the relativity between revenue and supply costs. So I think that plays into the maturity, to be honest. So yes, I think there's probably things, certainly the sector I'm in, can learn from other geographies, but also probably different sectors. But then, as you know, each sector just does its things slightly differently, and has its own pockets of best practice and unique challenges. Certainly, the one I see is a lot of remote, working in the sector that I face into. So the unique supply chain challenges to get parts, 1,000 kilometres away from metro locations adds its own sort of unique complexities, and those organisations have grown some significant capabilities to overcome that.
Do you find that there's a large focus, and we talked a little bit off mic about this, around ESG in Australia, that is something that is particularly there's a particular point of focus for procurement teams where you are?
Yeah, we did, didn't we? Look, I think so, and different pockets for us. Probably across all elements of ESG. Certainly, decarbonisation is top of mind for every client. So they're all at different levels, but definitely pursuing significant efforts around sort of climate and circular economy. Probably the clients I face into, modern slavery is top in the mind, and probably cybersecurity not far behind. But certainly, modern slavery and human rights sort of is a key focus for many clients. And then for us, it's the social spending with a social conscience. So how do you actually support the communities that you operate in? So local and Indigenous business procurement is really top of mind. So yes, I'd say all three, depending on the priorities of the client, they'll be orientated towards one more than the other. But certainly, if you'd asked me a few months, it certainly cost. It was strong in cost. I think that pendulum is sort of swinging again. But yeah, the ESG factors are significant now on procurement.
Do you find that that's driven top down, or whether that's procurement leaders trying to reposition the value proposition?
It's a good question. I think really it's top down. I mean, if I look at the clients I face, if I look at the social side, social license to operate, it's critical. So now the business is driving those requirements. Modern slavery is a CEO level issue, and obviously climate. So no, I think it's absolutely top down. I'd say most organisations I've dealt with have had an individual focused on one or more of those initiatives for a while, but they've been largely sort of powerless within the organisation. They've almost been like a lone voice within procurement trying to lobby for change. So I'd have to say 9 times out of 10, I think it's the business driving the change and then procurement reacting to kind of support.
It's interesting because you see, around different geographical areas, like here in the States and a lot of organizations, you're still at that lone wolf within procurement in some businesses trying to make this an issue that the organization should care about. And that is changing, but it's not changing to the extent that it has in Europe and Australasia, for example, because, perhaps there's a reputational requirement to do so, but also in some cases a regulatory reason to do so as well.
Yeah, and one of the main clients I've dealt with, they've recently changed their whole performance metrics model to include elements of ESG, particularly the local and Indigenous procurement. So when a general manager's sort of REM is at stake for hitting those targets, it creates a different organisational appetite to drive it. But again, probably more a business-led initiative to rethink that. Well,
in the podcast today, we want to talk about turning procurement into a high-performing function. And rather than go through a bunch of Q&A, what I thought I'd do is, I know you've got a theory. So I want to give you the opportunity to share your theory, and let's try and unpack it and have a little bit of a conversation around it.
Yeah, lovely. And look, thanks for this. Yeah, I'm really keen to sort of throw the concept into the community. I think, and I've listened to a few of your podcasts recently around, we've been lobbying as a function to have that seat at the table. I think I think like always more to do. But I think sort of procurement has really really come on a long way. Look, we discussed COVID was the best thing to ever happen for our function in terms of the focus on supply chain. I think that word got used more times in a year than it probably ever did in 100 years preceding. So what it created was a real alignment or a focus on procurement supply practitioners. And I think largely, certainly the clients I see, they really we stepped up to the task. We aligned 100% to the business, and we really focused on security of supply. And you know, certainly in the industries I've dealt with, managed it well, albeit with high levels of inventory, but we kind of got our organisation through the crisis. So I think it's engendered a level of respect and credibility. But back to that ESG question, we're now seeing a lot of work. So this new high level of sort of respect is actually engendering an awful lot of work, good work, that's now coming into a procurement team. And as I unpack the agendas, you know, security of supply, there's still chronic labour shortages and part shortages. So security of supply remains priority. Cost, unfortunately, is back. You know, there's raging inflation across most areas. On top of third-party risk at unprecedented levels, we've touched on human rights and cybersecurity, and then add into that the need to say spend with a social conscience. So I've got to drive down my supply base, but I've also got to drive up my supply base with minority and Indigenous businesses, and I've got to do all of that in a sort of a climate-conscious way. And if you really ask yourself, all of my categories and strategies have been tuned for the past 20 years to solve for cost. They're almost certainly all wrong under the light of where we're trying to go from an environmental perspective. So there's a whole rework required across the whole category strategy domain. So I think there's more work than ever, and it's compounded by at a time when there's also challenges in talent, particularly around the sort of the scarcity. People are moving roles. I don't know if it's slowed down in the US, but certainly there's still challenges for most.
You see a lot of churn. Do you in procurement teams?
A lot of churn. Most organisations are running with some level of vacancies, so they're hard to get through the work. So the question I'm really sort of starting to think through is with all of that work, with the challenges in talent, in terms of capacity of talent, and I do think there's a broader kind of capability question, but we kind of won't go there on this call. But I think there's this sort of how do I really make sure I've got a system for understanding the work and actually making sure I'm actually working on the right teams, the right things, and that my people are actually then working efficiently through that work. And what we don't see, and I haven't seen really many clients handle this, is there's no mechanism really to have a good view of the portfolio. So if you ask yourself at any one time, what am I working on? I've put all of these targets into the market around cost, around Indigenous, around climate. What am I working on that's moving those agendas? And am I confident I can hit all of those targets? I don't think there's a way in most organizations to really understand the full package of work. We see many of the source to pay solutions a pretty good mechanism to actually capture sourcing projects, albeit the clock starts ticking on the sourcing project from the day that the RFP got loaded in, not all the work that will run up to putting it in the first place. But again, I'd hypothesize that's only about 40% of the actual work and tasks that procurement folks do. So all of those other things that come out of SRM meetings, contract performance reviews, all the big ideas workshops that kind of come up with a lot of ideas, all the category risk assessments that have identified a risk and triggered an activity to go and solve said risk. None of that sort of sits in a way that can be sort of searchable and tracked. So what I'm really seeing is a need to bring all of that together into a consolidated view. In addition, we talked a bit offline again, this concept of an intake engine from the business. So when the business, a bit like IT, when my laptop's broken, I log my ticket on a ticketing tool. Procurement often doesn't have that mechanism to kind of log the demand. So all of that plumbing needs to be in place, centralized into a portfolio management sort of capability, so we can kind of see the work and then start to allocate it to the available resources. So I think that's step one, is get the visibility and the allocation. That would be a start. Then we can ask ourselves questions around run our start, stop, continue workshop. What should we do? What should we drop?
Yeah.
What should we continue to do? I think that's the silver bullet. And then really it's about an optimization of the work. Once it's then allocated, then I can start running my metrics and analysis on, am I actually getting through the work efficiently? And certainly I've seen there's different folks from outside of procurement have come into procurement. I remember speaking to an ops manager who had inherited a large sort of procurement function. And I always remember him saying, I used to run a team, similar size, a couple of hundred people in operations. We had KPIs. I knew what they were doing. I come into procurement. I just don't even understand. I don't understand what these guys do, and I don't understand whether we work, whether we're actually efficient at what
the time.
Yeah. So it's the concept of bringing operational excellence into procurement, and then second is I reflect on my life now on the other side as a consultant. And I do recognise we are a different business, but the way we sort of we live and die in consulting is we've got to make sure we get our people busy. So there's a whole support structure and looking ahead of the work and then looking at the bench that's coming through, and there's a whole resource manager concept around how we manage our team. And again, I've never seen that really in a procurement team. I've seen a talent manager. And never really a resource manager to think about how we're actually optimizing talent. So not expecting industry clients to take all of that, but a sprinkling of that concept, a sprinkling of operational excellence, and how can we infuse that pragmatically into our sort of BAU procurement functions. Because when all said and done, most of what we do in procurement outside of sort of P2P is projects, it's project work.
So it's what are we doing today, and getting a good picture of what we're doing today, then is that what we should be doing, and getting a good understanding of what's coming down the road so you can plan around that. And then what's the ROI of the tasks that we are actually doing, and how do we optimize for it? So if I go on the first piece about visibility, as you're talking about visibility and lack of visibility, I'm thinking in a small business, let's say, and I don't know if this scales or not, but you could look at, and even I think you do this sometimes on a consulting perspective when you're working contractor or as a freelancer and you're tracking your hours. You can do a lot of time tracking. I did this task, this is what I did, this is how long I spent on it. So there's the ability to do that manually, and there's really the ability in some regard to do that in a semi-automated fashion. Do you think that procurement professionals, and any real professionals, would rebel against that, I'm being watched, or because it's really interesting?
I think so. And when we've tested we're starting to test the concepts. I think as I'm starting to think, there's definitely a horizons, and this concept of timesheeting and breaking and allocating your time to work, I definitely would park and move to a sort of a future horizon. I'd start, say, firstly with the work and just make sure are the tasks that we are doing okay, and then I look at just the sheer cycle time of how long it's taking me to complete a project before I worry about necessarily the percentage of my day. But thinking about introducing the concepts like standard units of work. A medium sourcing project should take 12 weeks. But I'm taking 20. What's wrong? But yes, look, over time, of course, we should start to think about that. But I think baby steps. I think around drilling sort of to an individual level of timesheeting. Not many of the clients I'm speaking to are quite ready, and I think you'd probably need to have an organizational view on that. Like, does IT do that? Does finance and HR?
Is it because they don't trust me? There's very much because I wouldn't want it, or I could see that I would, rebel against it because you feel it's a trust issue.
And you don't need to. I just don't think you need to in step one. I'd go there at a later stage when you're really looking to further optimize it, when you've already picked some of the lower hanging fruit.
And there's, as you think about what we do, there's a certain percentage which is process driven, and that's what you can talk about, the sourcing process, for example. And then there's a certain amount that is not process driven, and that's the hardest stuff to measure is, you maybe see the outcomes of that work, but you don't necessarily see what goes into driving those outcomes.
Yep.
When you think about, because you talked about an intake process, and intake is something that, we see, certainly here in the States, a growing market around having a, whether it's a triage process or everything at least going through to a single part. Now, are you seeing more and more clients adopt something like that, whether it's, built for purpose procurement intake, or it's a ticketing system that IT uses that we've kind of dressed up and used for procurement? Are you seeing more businesses at least in place?
Yeah, look, we are. I think that is a growing area and it's either built within a source to party technology that's being used, or it's typically the sort of the central functions ticketing engine, as you say. I think IT is a good example of an organisation that has been on that journey. So a lot of organisations are looking to extend their ticketing solution from IT, from facilities, and thinking about how we can do that across procurement. It's just not widely. I just don't think it's hit mainstream. But I do think we are starting to see people get on that route. Yes.
Do you think as I think about work allocation, do we have a good sense on what is actually the high value work versus what is not the high value work, or perhaps our position on what's high value work is something that's just been drilled into us over the last 20 years of associating it with spend, because that's just the easiest way for us to figure out.
I think that's a great question, and we spent a lot of time looking at this. I think that's when I think about this portfolio management, that would be almost the first thing you'd need to do is come together as a leadership group and understand how you're translating the corporate strategy, and you should be using that as the guidance of what's important. So if the CEO is driving a strategy, for ESG, as we've described, is significantly corporation that needs to flow through into the prioritization engine. So I'd say most organizations or most procurement teams don't have as you say, don't have an effective way of thinking through that prioritization. It's important as the business have told me it's important, or it's, as you say, it's a big project for me because it's going to deliver some cost savings. So I think there's definitely a rethink around how we define value. And then also, what do we do when there's sort of competing priorities? Because depending on who you ask in an organization, you'll get a different answer to the same question. So there needs to be a governance mechanism to probably think about how do we make sort of trade-off decisions if we can't agree on what's more important.
Yeah, I think my team is probably sick of me talking about governance internally. And if they listen to this, they'll probably be laughing as I talk about it. But I do think that governance is a big part of the answer to alignment. Because at the end of the day, if you can get together the people who are paying the bills of procurement and align those on what the most value that you can create for them is, and then when there's trade-offs, you're deciding those trade-offs at that level. You're not making the decision yourself on what you think, or perhaps because I think we're challenged somewhat because we made the pitch for investment in procurement based on cost savings alone. And so wherever there's conflict, we always take the cost savings route because that's what we feel will demonstrate our promise. And having governance is a really big driver of alignment.
And certainly when we've been thinking about this portfolio capability, it often is again inspired probably from the business partnering model. So most organizations over here have, the mature ones, larger ones, have a business partner function that links into a function. So it really is to arm that individual with the visibility engine to have a good conversation with their business. So as new demand comes in and you say, well, I can't fulfill that demand because I'm already at capacity, work with the business to understand how to prioritize. So as you say, the resolution for value is really back to the business who are, as you say, paying the bills, and they'll be a better judge of value than the procurement team, which is there to serve the business.
What would be an example of something that at face value we believe is strategic and important, when in reality, when you look at outcomes, it might not be?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. Our process. I think we're often slaves to our own process. So often those big contract renewals that then trigger large RFPs on stable kind of categories where nothing's really changed. So we go through a long process to often come up with a very similar answer.
Yeah.
At great cost and great time. There's then other categories where, depending on the size of your organization, you're realistically going to be a price taker or a terms taker. And you see some of the facing into some of those really large sort of software organizations. It is kind of a take it or leave it situation in some cases. So again, spending a lot of time trying to force organizations onto your own contract terms because that's what you're used to, probably stimulated from your direct procurement category where you really do have leverage. I think that's sometimes the challenge is we just run the process because our process says, our policy says we have to run it that way. And then, I talked off air that we compound it often with categories. So we have static category teams where they're going to fill their days with the work that's in their category. It just can't possibly be true that always that is a perfect balance. Or, if there's better work in another category, there's often no mechanism to sort of reprofile some of the workers that are working on a lower priority in one category to the benefit of a different category. Even if there's a will, even if there was an interest, there's not generally the ability for somebody to be curious, spot those opportunities, and offer up their analysts as an example to go and work on a different category.
Yeah, oftentimes it's, if that category is in a really good place, it's almost like, I've put in the hard yards and now I'm just going to enjoy the fact that it's in a good place and, I'll block and tackle. And just keep it kind of going rather than, all right, where can I go and make a difference now while this is kind of humming along over here?
Yep.
Is there a way to start thinking about like scaling that decision mechanism of this isn't high value work, even though, kind of how do we get to that decision point where everyone's kind of comfortable with a way of approaching to say, what, is it really worth us going and renegotiate, spending all this time to renegotiate a cloud agreement versus there's actually something in this part of the business which is low spend but high value from an innovation perspective and we should redirect resources over there?
Yeah, and you touched on the G word, governance. It is just thinking through that mechanism. I think you'd start within, for me, business partnering is probably the way of looking at it. Think about the work that procurement is doing for an individual business unit and reprofile within that business unit is a simple way of thinking about it. Next step is then how do you look across the whole landscape of work, and I think that's a bit trickier. But having those mechanisms, so the concept of a quarterly business partner planning meeting where you sit down and look at the portfolio of the work with the impacted business units is it often happens. But it happens on spreadsheets and it happens with an incomplete picture of the work. So I think you take some of the processes that potentially are already existing around the business partnering model, if that exists in the organization, and look to sort of scale and improve that. And if business partnering doesn't exist as a concept, it's probably then a different conversation further up the food chain around things in the operating model. But then again, within the procurement function, not too difficult to think that there would already be routines where the management team come together and really look at that work. So it is, setting up that operational rhythm with the head of procurement and his or her direct reports to actually have some of those conversations. So governance and using that portfolio, and then there's probably got to be somebody, either full-time or a portion of somebody's time, to kind of take ownership of that work, and an ops excellence kind of role, and ops excellence sort of manager to kind of drive that conversation.
Do we value time enough? And what I mean by that is, you talked a little bit about speed. And sometimes, we'll throw out, well, it's going to take me 20 weeks to do this RFP. And maybe it's going to take that time because I've got 50 other RFPs to do at the same time. And so I'm hedging my bets a little bit. But I wonder if sometimes we're not as attuned to moving quickly as we could be.
Yeah, look, I 100% agree. I think I certainly see different organizations have project procurement sitting in or outside of procurement. So capital projects procurement clearly understand the value of time, but most procurement organizations I've seen have that sitting as its own different organization. So I think probably a loaded question from yourself there, but look, no is the answer. I don't think we do value time in industry roles. I think a lot of the deadlines for contracts, they feel soft. When we don't hit them, we just extend the time with no sort of seeming consequence. And it was a bit back to your timesheeting question. And but if I had to account for my time, and if I was a service provider on a fixed price deal, and I had to finish within a certain time, I think I would act very differently than an internal function where the time value of the value of the human capital is just not accounted for.
It's very interesting, isn't it, when you go from a practitioner into a consulting environment. I did the same in outsourcing, and there was a lot of things that I learned, around in an outsourcing environment, like, service delivery and the focus on, ultimately at the end of the day, if you didn't perform, you would get fired as a client, and therefore there is no excuses. You have to perform, and you got to find ways to perform. And there was the structures that are built around bringing accountability to that I've always talked about would be beneficial for internal procurement teams to adopt as well. I know we talked about, as you moved into a consulting role, the focus on resource planning. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that generally looks like in a professional services firm, because, that may give some ideas to practitioners on how they can start thinking about that within their own internal organization.
Yeah, so certainly we too much of it, right? We certainly have a rhythm, an internal, rhythm where we have a dedicated resourcing manager. You need to get the critical, obviously, scale of size, but where we would look at sort of who's coming available each week, and then what's the pipeline of work coming, so we can actually start to match and tag people to that work. And I think the interest in, and where you go in sort of horizon 2 and 3, we also try and match not just people's skills and capabilities, but also their interests to the type of work that they're trying to do. And again, that doesn't always happen, I think, in industry role. What is that individual? They want to do more on an ESG related topic, as an example. We try and pair them up to, more of an ESG related project coming down the line. So again, that visibility of the work allows you to actually do some really nice things from a sort of a talent development perspective. But it's a governance piece. It requires input to the system of when you're coming free, and what is the work. So it's the marrying up of a couple of pieces of information managed by a human that needs to kind of look across those data sources to whip us all into shape. And there is discipline in keeping those, a little bit of discipline. It's not a lot of work, but it's a little bit of discipline in keeping those systems up to date around what you're working on and when you're free.
And as I think about that from procurement, it's like it goes back to that intake we talked about before a little bit. It goes to spend analytics and understanding what you have that's coming up for renewal, when it's coming up for renewal, planning and prioritizing around that, having an intake that gets you exposure as quickly as you possibly can to new work that's going to come in, so that we're not so reactive. Because that's what I feel like it's hard because you're looking at it from a consulting perspective, almost like we've got this pool of labor. So how do I best utilize that pool of labor based on the work that I know is coming? And a lot of internal teams don't have the purview into the work that's coming to even be able to start thinking strategically about how to best put, the talent pool of procurement to use.
And I'd certainly hypothesize that industry clients have it far easier than consultants, because we're at the mercy of clients starting work. So most of the industry work can be planned with a far greater degree of accuracy than the work that we deal with. So yes, I think probably no excuses, I would suggest.
So we've talked about a number of different kind of ideas and concepts around the challenge and the hypothesis that we put together, but how can we start bringing this all together so we can kind of connect the dots? How do you think about it in a way that is probably a little bit more easy to visualize and then to start thinking through, okay, what do we do about this?
Yeah, no, great question. So certainly in my mind, there's sort of probably a clear sort of 4-step model that you'd kind of go through. I think the first is the grab of the pipeline. So it's the grab of data. Get a consolidated view of the work. And that's going to be through, initially it's going to be a manual grab of you going through your systems. What is in your sourcing tool? What's in your contracts repository that you can look forward? And then probably an engagement with the business partners or whoever kind of got that purview of demand. Then you'd kind of be able to do that first quick win, which is the start, stop, continue, just to make sure that you're working on the right things. I think step 2 then is finding a way of industrializing and sustaining that, because that would have taken a little bit to get done for the first time, and you've got to sustain that. So that's where you certainly look at a technology solution to feed the work into, so a centralized plan. And when we're working with a couple of sort of good integrators, there's plenty of options in the market as to who you can partner with. And then the ones that, as we described, if you don't already have an intake or a ticketing solution, that's, I think, where you'd need to kind of create that piece. So the step 2 is the automation of the work, and you can already automatically feed all of the contracts, all of the sourcing stuff, and come straight into the engine and feed a pipeline. So step 1 and 2 is really getting the visibility of the work. I think then now into sort of step 3, you'd start to think through, now I can see the work, I'd codify the types of projects that I'm working on and create standard units of time for projects, simple, medium, high complexity sourcing project. So I'd load my data and start to understand, then I can start to run some sort of cycle time analysis. So really that's starting to measure the efficiency of the work in step 3. And then step 4, once I can see the work and the efficiency, I'm then going to have a whole raft of improvement actions that will fall out of it, which will be including but not limited to things like, reviewing the process, the sourcing process step, and challenging myself. Do I really need 15 control points across the life cycle of the project? Why is the 12-week sourcing project taking 20? It might be some capability, training. There'll be certain interventions that I need to take place. It could be introduction of robotics or automation to kind of further streamline.
It's interesting. You can start looking at what's the ROI of the different activities that you do.
What's the ROI?
And then looking at, low ROI, then what can I do with that so that we're really focused? And that's where the high performing function comes in. We're really focusing on high ROI activities and work.
100%. Yeah.
So, Chris, it's been a pleasure to chat. I don't know how it's taken us so long to actually do this. But, the last question I always ask is, if listeners are interested to connect, talk about this topic anymore with you and throw around some ideas, where's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, look, hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm super passionate about this. I'd love to engage with other sort of folks that are interested in exploring this topic further. Just find me on LinkedIn, and then we can kind of work from there.
All right. Well, I'll include a link to your LinkedIn profile on the show notes page. That'll be artofprocurement.com/podcast. And let's make it not another 8 years before we go between doing another one.
Absolutely. Absolute pleasure. Mate.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.